The presentation today is about declaring funding sources for research. It is a glimpse into guidance that has not fully been finalized. So before we totally finalize it, we wanted to hear from you if there's anything striking in what we're saying that or not saying in the document that you wanted to have some input in. It is not one of our guidance documents that's trying to highlight what to do when things go awry, but rather educational around best practices for ethical publishing. As Dan mentioned, and I'm sure most of you know, we've launched our 2025 to 2028 strategic plan, and trying very hard to base our work in the tenets of that strategic plan. And so I've pointed out here on this slide where that fits in today. So our overall purpose is to educate and advance knowledge and methods of safeguarding the integrity of the scholarly record for the benefit of the public. And the two major pillars that I'm addressing today of that strategic plan are to provide education and support to empower you and other stakeholders to uphold the integrity of the publication process and the published record, and also to make sure research is accountable. That's one of the other strategic pillars that we have, and I think this particular type of guidance will be helpful regarding accountability for who's paying for things that are published in your journals. Next slide. So why are we talking about funding statements? What's the issue here, and why is it important? Next slide, please. There are numerous organizations that have made statements in the past regarding the importance of including separate funding statements in published journals. And I'm going to just show you, I think, 3 of them from different places that really, I think, are foundational in suggesting that it is important when research has been funded or not to make it clear who funded it, if someone did, and some details about that funding instrument or grant. So in 2010, the Second World Congress on Research Integrity out of Singapore made a statement that COPE has endorsed, and it says that all sources of research funding, including both direct and indirect financial support, supply of equipment or materials, and other support, such as specialist statistical or writing assistance, should be disclosed. Authors should disclose the role of the research funder or funders or sponsor, if any, in the research design, execution, analysis, interpretation, and reporting. And I'd like to underline that it is our position. This is not necessarily exactly what the World Congress stated quite so clearly, but that it is the responsibility of the authors to disclose all funding sources in their original submission. And so this ends up being a author responsibility to inform you as a editor of a journal or a publisher of a journal what the funding sources are. Next slide, please. 2 others, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, in their document describing the disclosure of financial and non-financial relationships and activities and conflict of interest notes, which is a fairly lengthy document. So I really pulled out the credibility, the section on funding. In this document, they note that the credibility of a paper depends in part on transparency about relationships and how they relate to the planning, implementation, writing, peer review, editing, and publication of scientific work. Disclosure of potential conflicts of interest is distinct and extends beyond direct support for the work. Within a manuscript, the funding statement should include only direct support of the work described. Two of the reporting guidelines that are commonly used in research publications include the Consort 2020 or 2010 guidance. This relates to the publication of systematic reviews, and PRISMA 2020, excuse me, the Consort is about randomized controlled trials, and the PRISMA guidelines of 2020 are about systematic reviews. These guidelines state, and it's on their checklist for submission, that a source of funding or other support, the example they give is the supply of medications, and the role of the funders must be included in the paper. Next slide. So those are three different takes on relevant organizations that have stated that we need to be including funding statements. So why are these important? Since I hope I've established that that there's a reason for doing so, and I will say it's also included in our COPE best practices that a funding statement is included. So what are the benefits, and why are these important? First and foremost, it's for the reader. This goes back to our strategic plan that we're about the public, so I'm going to include the readers in the publics. It provides transparency to assess possible conflicts of interest related to funding, and to be aware that the sources of what the sources of support for the published research are. And notably, funding is a source of conflicts or competing interests, but it needs to be uniquely described, separate from a COI statement. For the grantee, it allows them to express gratitude to their sources of support. I will say, in the discussions that led up to developing this document, as far as it has come at this point, there was some back and forth about whether this is a legitimate reason for including a funding statement or a benefit for the grantee. And I've gone through several journals and looked at their funding statements or their acknowledgments in the back, and many times the grantee does express gratitude. And so I think this is a mechanism of allowing them to do so in a more standardized way. Also, for the grantee, it is a demonstration to the funders for their research about how they utilize their funding. And this may be important in future grant applications. Granted, most funding agencies require a separate report back to them, but it is another way of demonstrating, look, I got this funding from this organization under this grant title. And I've been at least as far as producing research output, I've been a good steward of those resources that I received. Next slide. Going on with purposes of the funding statement, for the funding agency, it allows them to track by the funding agency the output from research they have funded. Notably, many of these big organizations are also doing that in the background electronically, keeping track of funding statements that have been published and included in metadata. It allows the ability of funders to confirm that the cited funding was in fact related to the research, and conversely, that grants or other funding instruments not related to the publication are not identified as related to it. And this has become a bit of an ethical issue itself, where authors are either claiming or irrelevant funding or padding the funding statement with others. Again, this is a documentation of good stewardship of the granting agency funds, whether those are federal or private funders. For example, if a government agency is supporting research, they need to demonstrate to taxpayers that they are funding relevant work. This is one mechanism for doing that. Some government agencies are legally required to report research output from sponsored research. And I've left it off here, but for private funding agencies, they get their funds from donors primarily, and they also need to be demonstrating to the donors that they've used their contributions wisely, or at least productively. It also is a way for grantors to help prevent fraud. And this has been happening in some cases where grantees have listed grants that did not actually provide funding for the work reported in the paper, or they've listed individuals who contributed to the work but actually were not funded by a specific grant, or omitting a grant that did actually support the work. Next slide, please. A couple of funders' requirements that they include in their information to the grantees rather, and the people who receive funding from at least these three samples that I'm going to give you here have to include what the funding organization says they have to include in the disclosure, and I'm going to get back to that. The UK Research and Innovation organization says, at a minimum, the funding should be acknowledged with a sentence with the funding agency written out in full, followed by the grant number in square brackets. So they're even explicit about the punctuation. Next slide. The U.S. National Institutes of Health, and I'm not going to read through all of this, but there are three explicit components that they ask of their grantees to include. These include a statement that says all grants supported the work reported in the publication should be included in the statement. Grants that did not should not be there. There should be a direct line between what is in the paper and any funding sources. So that includes what the funding agency is, who was covered by, what the grant number was, who was included in that funding, and further, you'll see there's additional information that they want in there. An acknowledgement of the level of NIH funding that indicates the percentage and dollar amounts of the total program or project costs financed with federal money, and the percentage and dollar amount of the total costs financed by non-governmental sources, and a disclaimer that says that the work is the responsibility of the authors. Next slide, please. The European Research Council says that for all output funded by ERC grants, the European Union emblem and the ERC logo must be displayed together. They also have a statement that the work is that of the authors and doesn't necessarily express their opinions, and that the ERC requires that specific information is noted in the paper, including the work that's supported, and that the acronym number and project DOI be included. New paragraph, or next slide, please. I do want to emphasize that the grantee has, as part of their agreement with their funding agencies, if they have lists of things like I've just demonstrated to you that have to be included, that's part of their agreement with the funding organization. And this is an example of a current description that I came across. Authors must disclose who provided support for the conduct of the research and or the preparation of the article. Role of sponsors, if any, should be declared. Listing of funding agencies in a standard way to facilitate compliance to the funding requirements, and it gives a description of this. If no funding has been provided, it is recommended to include the following statement. This research did not receive any specific grant from funding agencies in the public, commercial, or non-profit sectors. So recall, going back to the earlier illustrations, even if there's no funding, there was no funding statement needs to be included. Next, please. So this is the core of the recommendations for best practice that we are in the final format likely to be recommending. So at the very least, they should name the funding organization and the specific instrument's number or other designation, which authors are linked to that particular funding instrument, and a description of that direct link between the funding instrument and the paper. Journals should include information in their information to authors how to cite research support for papers published in their journals so that authors know about it. You can put it basically anywhere that you want to in the published article, whether it's in the front matter, in the method section, or within a designated funding section. And journals have to be, and publishers who because this is a legal contract between the grantee and the grantor, it might be that the legal teams for publishers might need to be included in this if there's a dispute. They must be flexible about what to include if there is specific information that a funder requires that is not included in the journal's description. So adopting what is necessary, or frankly choose not to publish a paper whose funder requires more than the journal is willing to include. Those are your choices as an editor or publisher. Publish it with the required elements, or don't publish it and let the authors go elsewhere. Next chapter. Next slide. So this would be an example of a table that you might want to include. It's not necessarily the format you want to include, but it is an example of one way you could do it. So a table that includes the funding instrument or grant, that would be the granting agency, the grant type, and the specific identifier. So as an example, the National Institutes of Health has multiple different kinds of grant types, and R01 being a grantees initiated research, and then the number, which authors are linked, and a statement about what that covered. If there's a training grant for graduate students whose funds were used to support the learners' work, that should be listed as well. If it's a research grant, an internal research grant, for instance, for recruiting participants in a study, that should be included. And if the institution paid for the article processing fees, that would be applicable to all the authors, and that should also be included.